The sun was beating down on the asphalt of Oakwood Crest, turning the pristine cul-de-sac into a shimmering heat trap. Marcus Vance wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand, his lungs burning slightly from the humidity. He adjusted the brim of his faded Swift drop cap, squinting at the GPS on his wrist. He had been on the road since 5 in the morning, and this was the delivery that mattered most. He moved to the back of the van, the metal handle of the rolling door burning his palm. With a heavy groan of hinges, he revealed the massive, custom-built wooden crate nestled inside. It was heavy, awkward, and worth more than most people made in a year. Marcus carefully slid the heavy-duty dolly underneath the crate, his muscles tensing under his sweat-stained vest as he tilted the weight back. He wasn't just a man delivering a package, he was a man on a mission, though to anyone driving by, he looked like just another invisible laborer in a neighborhood that preferred its service workers to be seen and not heard. The silence of the gated community was suddenly shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high-end sandals on concrete. Victoria Sterling marched down her driveway like a general approaching a front line, her designer yoga leggings perfectly pressed and a neon green juice clutched in her hand like a scepter. She didn't look at Marcus's face, she looked at his scuffed boots and then at the van parked 3 inches past the line of her property. Her nose crinkled as if she had just stepped in something foul. She stopped exactly 2 feet away from him, placing a hand on her hip and checking her gold watch with a theatrical sigh. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she let out a sharp, jagged noise of disgust that cut through the quiet morning air. Marcus stopped the dolly, keeping his voice low and professional. He had dealt with people like this before, but there was a specific kind of venom in Victoria's eyes that felt personal. He offered a polite nod, his voice steady despite the heat. He explained that the neighboring estate's driveway was blocked by a landscaping truck and that he only needed 5 minutes to navigate this crate to the front door. He used the word please. He used the word ma'am. But Victoria wasn't listening to his words, she was reacting to his presence. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her juice, her eyes scanning his faded uniform with a sneer that made her face look like a mask of porcelain cracking under pressure. She asked him if he even knew where he was, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was more insulting than a scream. She told him that Oakwood Crest had standards, and those standards didn't include beat-up delivery vans idling in front of her Tuscan-style villa. When Marcus tried to show her the digital manifest, she stepped back as if his touch might contaminate her. She began to raise her voice, her tone climbing into a shrill, hysterical register, accusing him of casing the neighborhood and looking for an open window. She pulled out her phone, the sunlight glinting off the expensive camera lens as she pointed it directly into his face. She demanded to see his identification, his work permit, and a reason why a man like him was wandering around a neighborhood where he clearly didn't belong. In the background, a young boy named Leo hopped out of the passenger side of Victoria's idling SUV. He stood by the garage door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, watching his mother with a look of profound, quiet shame. He whispered for her to stop, telling her it was just a package, but Victoria snapped at him to get inside and lock the door. She turned back to Marcus, her face flushed a blotchy red, screaming that she was the president of the Homeowners Association and that she would have his job by lunch. Marcus felt the familiar sting of injustice rising in his throat, the weight of the heavy crate suddenly feeling like the weight of the world, but he didn't break. He simply gripped the handles of his dolly, looked directly into her recording phone, and told her to have a blessed day. It was the one thing she didn't want to hear, a man she deemed beneath her refusing to be broken by her noise. The camera lens on Victoria's phone felt like a weapon, but Marcus stared past it, his mind suddenly drifting away from the scorching heat of the driveway and back to a cold, sterile hallway 15 years in the past. He could almost smell the floor wax of St. Jude's Prep, the kind of school where the tuition cost more than a mid-sized sedan. A younger Marcus, barely 13 years old, sat on a hard wooden bench, clutching a gold-plated scholarship trophy until his palms bled. He had been the brightest star in his class, a tech prodigy who saw code as poetry. But in that hallway, he wasn't a scholar, he was just the janitor's son. He remembered the heavy, rhythmic thud of his father's work boots approaching, followed by the sight of his father's slumped shoulders. A wealthy, influential parent had misplaced a diamond-encrusted watch in the locker room, and because Marcus's father was the one holding the mop, he was the only one holding the blame. Marcus remembered looking up to see a teenage girl with blonde pigtails standing near the principal's office, a cruel, knowing smirk playing on her lips. It was Victoria. Even then, she carried herself with a lethal sense of entitlement, as if the very air she breathed was a gift she allowed others to share. She had leaned against the locker, tossed her hair, and told Marcus in a voice loud enough for the entire hallway to hear that blood always finds its level. She told him that his scholarship didn't change the fact that he was born to serve people like her. She mocked his father's stained uniform and whispered that one day, if Marcus worked really hard, he might grow up to carry her luggage. That day, Marcus watched his father get escorted out of the building like a common criminal, his dignity stripped away by a lie that the school was too afraid to challenge. The memory snapped back into the present as Victoria's shrill voice pierced the air, demanding to know if he was even listening to her. Marcus looked at her now, seeing the same cruel teenage girl hidden beneath the Botox and the designer athleisure. She didn't realize that the delivery guy she was filming was the man who had spent the last decade building an empire out of the very technology she used to harass him. He wasn't wearing this faded vest because he had to. He was wearing it because he was the CEO of Vance Logistics, personally conducting a field stress test of his new, last-mile, delivery software. He wanted to see the obstacles his drivers faced, but he never expected the greatest obstacle to be a ghost from his past. Victoria continued her tirade, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated prejudice. She muttered something under her breath about how these people were ruining the neighborhood's property value, her eyes darting to her neighbor's house as if looking for an audience for her performance. Marcus felt a cold, calm resolve settle over him. He knew something she didn't. He knew that her husband's investment firm was currently hemorrhaging cash, and that the Sterling family was one bad month away from losing the very driveway she was standing on. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The woman who was currently trying to get a delivery man fired was the same woman whose lifestyle was about to be decided by that very man's board of directors. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every passing second, Victoria's smirk returned. She adjusted her grip on her phone, making sure she was capturing the moment the police would arrive to deal with the problem. She told Marcus that his little game was over and that he'd be lucky to find a job sweeping floors when she was done with him. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply stood tall, his shadow stretching long across the pavement, thinking about his father's quiet dignity. He realized that Victoria hadn't changed in 15 years, but he had. He wasn't the scared boy on the bench anymore. He was the storm that was about to break over her perfect, sheltered life. And as the blue and red lights began to flash against the white stones of her villa, Marcus Vance simply smiled. The gravel crunched under the tires of a heavy luxury SUV as it swung into the driveway, cutting off any path for Marcus's delivery van. Richard Sterling stepped out, adjusting the sleeves of his crisp linen shirt, his face already set in a mask of protective aggression. He didn't ask what was happening. He simply took one look at his wife's hysterical state and then at the black man in the work vest, and his eyes narrowed with a cold, corporate disdain. Victoria's voice reached a fever pitch, her finger shaking as she pointed it inches from Marcus's chest. She screamed that she felt threatened, that this man was aggressive, and that he had refused to move after being caught prowling around their property. Richard stepped into Marcus's personal space, the smell of expensive sandalwood cologne clashing with the salt and sweat of the afternoon air. He told Marcus that he had exactly 10 seconds to get on the ground before things got ugly, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that assumed total authority. Standing just a few feet away, clutching Victoria's dry-cleaned dresses like a shield, was Sarah. She was the Sterling's personal assistant, a woman who usually spent her days being invisible while managing the chaos of their lives. She stood frozen, her eyes wide as she looked from the screaming woman to the calm man in the delivery cap. Her breath hitched. She had seen that man before. Just that morning, she had been scrolling through a business journal on her iPad, and the face staring back at her from the cover, the Wooloo Titan of the Year, was unmistakably the man now being humiliated in her employer's driveway. She opened her mouth to speak, but Victoria snapped at her to stay back and keep the garbage she was holding off the dirty ground. Sarah's knuckles turned white around the hangers. She looked at Marcus, and for a split second, their eyes met. He gave the tiniest shake of his head, a silent command to stay quiet. The screech of tires heralded the arrival of the police. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser, their hands hovering near their belts, their faces hardened by the urgent, suspicious person call Victoria had placed. Victoria didn't wait for them to approach. She ran toward them, her voice cracking with forced tears, claiming she feared for her life and the safety of her son. She played the part of the victim with practiced ease, her designer-clad body trembling as she pointed at Marcus. The officers, swept up in the theater of her wealth and status, didn't ask for Marcus's side of the story. They barked orders for him to put his hands behind his back. Marcus didn't resist. He felt the cold, biting metal of the handcuffs snap shut around his wrists, the jagged edges of the chrome digging into his skin. Richard stood with his arms crossed, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips as he watched Marcus being led toward the patrol car. He leaned in close to Marcus's ear, whispering that people like him should know better than to think they can just walk into a neighborhood like this and act like they own the place. Victoria followed them with her phone still raised, narrating to her followers about how she was cleaning up the streets and ensuring the neighborhood stayed safe. She laughed, a sharp, jarring sound that lacked any real joy, and told Marcus that he could kiss his miserable job goodbye because she was personally going to call the corporate office and make sure he never worked in this state again. As the officer pushed Marcus's head down to get him into the back of the cruiser, Marcus paused. He turned his head slightly, looking past the sneering couple and directly at Sarah, who was still standing by the garage. He gave her a sharp, knowing nod. Sarah felt a jolt of adrenaline, a realization that she was the only witness to the truth. She watched as the patrol car door slammed shut, muffling the sounds of Victoria's victory celebration. Inside the dim, plastic-smelling interior of the car, Marcus didn't look like a defeated man. He sat upright, the blue and red lights strobing against his calm face. He looked down at the smart tech watch on his wrist, which had been recording every second of the interaction, every slur, and every false accusation. The trap was set, and as the car began to pull away, Marcus Vance wasn't thinking about the jail cell, he was thinking about the boardroom. The fluorescent lights of the precinct intake center flickered with a rhythmic, maddening buzz that echoed the pounding in Marcus's head. He sat on a cold metal bench, his hands finally free of the cuffs but his wrists still bearing the angry, red indentations of the metal. Across the room, a desk sergeant was staring at a computer screen, his brow furrowing as he looked at the registration for the Swift Drop delivery van. He looked back at Marcus, then at the screen again, his entire posture shifting from dismissive to deeply concerned. Marcus didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence in the room grew heavy as the officers realized that the man they had treated like a common criminal was the registered owner of a logistics empire whose parent company held the lease on the very precinct building they were sitting in. Marcus's lead counsel, a sharp-eyed woman in a charcoal suit, marched into the room 10 minutes later, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the authority of a precision strike. She didn't look at the police, she looked only at Marcus, handing him a burner phone and a fresh bottle of water. As he took a sip, she leaned in, her voice a low, clinical whisper. She told him that the video Victoria Sterling had posted was already tearing through the local social media circles, but it was doing exactly what they had anticipated. Victoria had edited it to make Marcus look like a lurking threat, and the comments were filled with the kind of vitriol that made Marcus's jaw tighten. For a moment, it felt like a total defeat. His reputation, the brand he had built with his own blood and sweat, was being dragged through the mud by a woman who couldn't even manage her own household. But then, the lawyer's iPad chimed with a high-priority notification. She slid the device across the table to him, and Marcus felt a cold, sharp spark of realization ignite in his chest. It was a confidential financial brief regarding Sterling Investments. Richard Sterling, the man who had looked down his nose at Marcus just an hour ago, was currently in a state of absolute, hidden panic. His firm was drowning in toxic debt, and he had spent the last 48 hours desperately pleading for a private equity bailout to stay afloat. Marcus scrolled through the documents, his eyes landing on the name of the primary creditor, the Vance Group. Marcus was the person Richard was begging for a lifeline. The very man Richard had told to get on the ground, held the master key to his entire future. In that moment, the victim died, and the architect was born. Marcus stood up, his height filling the small room, his expression transitioning from exhausted to predatory. He didn't want a simple apology, and he didn't want a quick settlement. He realized that Victoria's viral video was the perfect cover. It made her feel invincible, and an invincible enemy is a reckless one. He told his lawyer to halt the immediate defamation suit. He wanted the Sterlings to believe they had won. He wanted them to feel the intoxicating rush of their victory, so they would stop looking over their shoulders. Marcus looked at his reflection in the two-way mirror, straightening the collar of his delivery vest one last time. He thought about the heavy, wooden crate still sitting in the back of his van, the one Victoria had called an eyesore. Inside that crate was the final piece of the automation technology that would revolutionize the industry, a project he had named after his father. He realized that the best way to honor his father wasn't just to succeed, but to ensure that people like the Sterlings finally understood the true cost of their arrogance. He whispered to his lawyer that he wanted a full seat at the neighborhood charity gala scheduled for Friday. He wanted to be there when the Sterlings walked into the room, thinking they were the kings of Oakwood Crest, unaware that the ground beneath them had already been sold to the man they had tried to destroy. The following week was a blur of calculated, silent precision. Marcus Vance traded the sweat-stained delivery vest for the cool, crisp weight of charcoal wool and silk ties, but the fire that had ignited in that driveway hadn't dimmed. It had simply become a controlled burn. He sat in his glass-walled corner office, the skyline of the city sprawling out beneath him like a map he was finally learning to read. While the world saw a viral video of a suspicious delivery man being led away in cuffs, Marcus was quietly moving pieces across a board the Sterlings didn't even know existed. His fingers flew across his keyboard, authorizing the aggressive buyout of distressed debt and signing off on the final acquisition papers for Sterling Investments. Every click of the mouse felt like a strike against the handcuffs that had bitten into his skin. Across town, Victoria Sterling was basking in the glow of her digital infamy. She spent her afternoons at the Oakwood Country Club, the center of a buzzing circle of women who toasted her with chilled Chardonnay for her bravery. She sat with her legs crossed, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on her lips as she replayed the edited video for anyone who hadn't seen it yet. She spoke about the incident as if she had survived a war zone, describing Marcus not as a man doing his job, but as a dangerous element she had successfully purged from their paradise. She laughed about how easy it had been to get him fired, boasting that a single phone call to his little delivery company had settled the matter. She felt untouchable, a queen who had successfully defended her borders, never noticing that the servers hosting her viral video and the very network her phone ran on were subsidiaries of the man she was mocking. Richard Sterling was not celebrating. He sat in his mahogany-paneled home office, the air thick with the smell of expensive scotch and the copper tang of desperation. He stared at his monitor, watching the red numbers of his firm's valuation plummet while he waited for a call back from the Vance Group. He had sent 5 emails in 3 days, each more pleading than the last, begging for the bridge loan that would save his family from total ruin. He looked at a photo of his house, the marble foyer, the 6-car garage, and felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. He had no idea that the black guy he had threatened with jail time was currently the only person on the planet with the power to stop the foreclosure signs from being hammered into his front lawn. Marcus kept his movements invisible. He held secret, midnight meetings with Sarah, the Sterling's assistant, who met him at a quiet diner far from the gated community. She looked over her shoulder before handing him a flash drive, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and righteous excitement. On that drive was the Holy Grail, the full, unedited security footage from the Sterling's own smart home system, capturing Victoria's racial slurs and Richard's whispered threats. Marcus thanked her, his voice low and steady, promising her that her courage would be rewarded. He wasn't just building a legal case, he was preparing a public execution of their reputations. As the sun set on Thursday evening, Marcus stood on his balcony, watching the lights of Oakwood Crest flicker to life in the distance. He held the invitation to the Oakhaven Gala in his hand, the thick, cream-colored cardstock feeling like a weapon. He had spent the last few days in a relentless grind, coordinating with lawyers, publicists, and board members to ensure that the trap was perfectly sealed. He thought about the look on Victoria's face when she would eventually realize that the man she treated like trash was the one who owned the floor she stood on. He wasn't acting out of petty revenge, he was acting out of a deep, ancestral need for balance. The grind was over, the pieces were set, and the storm was finally ready to break. The air inside the Oakhaven Estates Grand Ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne, a cloying sweetness that seemed to mask the predatory nature of the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a shimmering, fractured light over the crowd, reflecting off diamond necklaces and polished tuxedo buttons. Victoria Sterling moved through the room like she owned the very air, her silk gown trailing behind her like a golden wake. She clutched a flute of vintage crystal, her laughter ringing out a bit too loudly, a bit too sharply, as she held court near the fountain. She was recounting the story of the delivery driver again, punctuating the narrative with dramatic gasps and rolling her eyes toward the high frescoed ceiling. She told the circle of nodding socialites that it was simply a matter of community hygiene, that someone had to stand up to the riffraff or the whole neighborhood would go to seed. Beside her, Richard Sterling looked like a man standing on a trapdoor. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, but his collar seemed to be choking him. He kept checking his phone, his eyes darting toward the entrance every time the heavy oak doors swung open. He was waiting for the mysterious, white knight, investor from the Vance Group, the man who was supposed to sign the papers tonight that would save his firm from a very public, very messy bankruptcy. He barely heard his wife's jokes. He was too busy rehearsing his pitch, making sure he sounded like a man of vision rather than a man on the brink of ruin. He was joined by Mr. Henderson, a senior board member with a face like crumpled parchment, who chuckled darkly and added that the viral video had been the best PR the neighborhood had seen in years. In the corner of the room, near the velvet-draped stage, a man stood with his back to the crowd. He was dressed in a tuxedo of such exquisite cut that it made the other men in the room look like they were wearing rentals. Victoria spotted him and, assuming he was part of the catering staff or perhaps a junior associate, she snapped her fingers sharply. She didn't look at his face, she only saw the broad shoulders and the dark skin of his neck. She marched over, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble, and held out her empty glass without even breaking her stride in conversation. She told him to be a dear and find her a refill, adding with a sharp, jagged sneer that the service tonight was surprisingly sluggish for such a prestigious event. The man didn't move immediately. He let the silence hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating pause that made Victoria's smile falter. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, melodic baritone that vibrated with a hidden power. He said that the delivery was almost complete, and that she should probably hold onto her glass, because she was going to need a drink for what came next. Victoria stiffened, the familiarity of the voice sending a cold shiver down her spine. She stepped around to face him, her mouth opening to deliver a blistering retort about insolence and staff training, but the words died in her throat. The man turning toward her was the same man she had filmed in her driveway, the same man she had called a suspicious element, the same man she thought she had destroyed with a single viral post. But he wasn't wearing a sweat-stained vest or a faded cap. Marcus Vance stood before her with the quiet, terrifying grace of a king. His eyes were calm, devoid of the anger she expected, replaced instead by a chilling, clinical pity. Richard Sterling approached then, his face lighting up with a desperate, sycophantic grin as he prepared to greet the guest of honor. But the grin froze, then shattered like glass as he recognized the face of his potential savior. The room seemed to go silent as the spotlight shifted, the master of ceremonies stepping toward the microphone to announce that the new owner of the Oakhaven estate and the majority shareholder of Sterling Investments had finally arrived. Marcus didn't look away from Victoria. He watched the color drain from her face until she was as white as the marble beneath her feet. The silence that descended upon the ballroom was not the polite hush of a captivated audience. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a structural collapse. Marcus Vance stepped onto the stage, his silhouette framed by the golden glow of the Oakhaven Estate's grand crest. He didn't rush to speak. He let the ambient noise of the party, the clinking of ice, the distant murmur of the kitchen staff, fade into nothingness. Victoria Sterling stood frozen at the foot of the stage, her hand still instinctively clutching her empty champagne glass, her knuckles turning a ghostly white. Her husband, Richard, looked as though he had been struck by lightning, his mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic gasp of realization. Marcus reached into the pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small remote. With a single click, the massive high-definition screens lining the ballroom walls flickered to life. The guests gasped as the viral video Victoria had shared all week began to play, but it wasn't the edited, grainy version that made Marcus look like a threat. It was the raw, high-fidelity footage from Marcus's own body camera and the unedited security stream Sarah had provided. The audio was crystal clear, cutting through the ballroom like a serrated blade. Every racial slur Victoria had spat, every arrogant laugh, and the moment Richard had threatened to have an innocent man thrown in a cage simply for standing in his driveway, it was all there. The socialites who had toasted Victoria only minutes ago now pulled away from her as if she were radioactive. Marcus leaned into the microphone, his voice calm, steady, and terrifyingly resonant. He told the room that a week ago, he was told he didn't belong in this neighborhood. He was told he was nothing more than an eyesore, a piece of trash to be swept away by those with better zip codes and deeper pockets. He paused, his gaze locking onto Victoria's trembling form. He told her that she had spent her whole life judging people by the uniform they wore, never realizing that the man she treated like a servant was the one who had been quietly keeping her husband's failing firm afloat for the last 6 months. Victoria finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a desperate, shrill croak. She stumbled toward the stage, her high heels catching on the hem of her expensive gown. She tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, a joke that had gone too far, her eyes darting around the room for a single friendly face. She looked at Richard, but he was staring at the floor, his spirit completely broken. Marcus didn't let her finish. He pulled a thick manila envelope from the podium and held it out. He informed her that as of 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Vance Group had completed the acquisition of Sterling Investments and had also purchased the primary mortgage on her residence. The color didn't just drain from Victoria's face, it seemed to vanish from her entire soul. Marcus told her that he had spent his life building things, while she had spent hers trying to tear people down. He delivered the final, crushing blow with a chillingly polite smile, informing her that her husband's employment was terminated for cause and that she had exactly 24 hours to vacate the property before the locks were changed. He told her that since she loved filming people so much, he had made sure the local news crews were waiting at the gates to document her move. The mic drop was literal. Marcus set the microphone down and walked off the stage, leaving the Sterlings standing in the ruins of their own arrogance while the crowd erupted into a mixture of shocked whispers and righteous applause. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered, right on time. The aftermath of the gala felt like the quiet, heavy air following a massive lightning strike. Victoria and Richard Sterling were not just removed from the ballroom, they were erased from the social fabric of Oakwood Crest overnight. By the next morning, the "for sale" sign that Marcus had ordered was hammered into the soft, green turf of their lawn, and a fleet of moving trucks, all bearing the Vance Logistics logo, arrived to haul away the remains of a life built on credit and cruelty. Neighbors who had once laughed at Victoria's viral video now peeked through their curtains in stony silence, terrified that their own secrets might be the next to face Marcus's light. Sarah, the assistant who had risked everything to do the right thing, walked out of the Sterling villa for the last time with a promotion letter and a starting bonus that would finally allow her to finish her degree. 5 years passed with the slow, inevitable rhythm of true progress. The Oakhaven estate was no longer a fortress for the wealthy to hide away from the world. Instead, the high iron gates had been replaced by a welcoming stone archway leading to the Vance Center for Technology and Ethics. The manicured lawns where Victoria had once screamed at a delivery driver were now filled with the laughter of scholarship students from across the city, young men and women who looked like Marcus did 15 years ago, gifted, hungry, and no longer invisible. Marcus himself walked through the gardens, no longer in a delivery vest or a tuxedo, but in a simple linen shirt, his face etched with the peace of a man who had finally settled his father's debts. One Tuesday afternoon, Marcus traveled back to the older part of the city for a site inspection. As he pulled his car to a stop near a public park, he noticed a woman in a bright orange reflective vest, hunched over a trash grabber. Her movements were slow, her shoulders slumped with the crushing weight of exhaustion. As he stepped out, the woman looked up, and for a fleeting second, the ghost of Victoria Sterling flickered in her tired eyes. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by the stiff, itchy fabric of court-ordered community service. She recognized him instantly, her hands trembling as she clutched a plastic bag filled with litter. But the fire was gone, there were no screams, no finger-pointing, and no phone recordings. She looked at Marcus and then quickly looked away, the burning shame of her own memory far more painful than any lecture he could have delivered. Marcus didn't stop to gloat. He didn't need to. He simply watched her for a moment, realizing that the greatest punishment for someone who thinks they are superior is to eventually realize they are exactly like everyone else. He noticed a young man in a university sweatshirt walking toward the bus stop nearby, waving at Victoria with a look of cautious love. It was Leo, her son. He was older now, standing tall, and his sweatshirt bore the emblem of the Vance Foundation. Marcus realized that while Victoria had lost her status, her son had found a future, proving that even the darkest cycles of prejudice could be broken by a single generation's choice to be better. As Marcus drove away, the sun setting behind the city skyline, he thought about the heavy wooden crate that had started it all. He realized that life is the ultimate delivery service. It doesn't always bring you what you want, but it always brings you exactly what you've earned. Karma isn't a shadow lurking in the dark. It's a mirror that eventually reflects your own heart back at you. He looked at the photo of his father tucked into his visor, a man who had died with nothing but his dignity, and smiled. The lesson was simple, written in the sweat of the worker and the silence of the powerful. You should never judge a book by its cover, because you never know when the person you are looking down on is the one who holds the pen to your final chapter.